to tell you involves a moment that changed everything. A young African revolutionary leader was invited to France's most prestigious television show, but what seemed like a cultural exchange turned into something extraordinary. When the arrogant host crossed a line that left viewers speechless, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response was so powerful, so unexpected, that it became a defining moment not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire generation of Africans worldwide. This is the story of how one man's quiet dignity turned mockery into a movement that still resonates today, and how a 35-year-old soldier became the voice of a continent's awakening. The invitation arrived on a humid Thursday morning in Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, received it through diplomatic channels, an invitation to appear on Le Grand Débat, France's most-watched political talk show, broadcast live from Paris to over 80 million viewers across Europe, Africa, and the Francophone world. The show's executive producer, Claire Rousseau, had pitched it as a historic dialogue between France and its former colonies. The timing was provocative, almost deliberately so. Burkina Faso had just expelled French troops from its territory, closed French military bases, and announced its withdrawal from the CFA franc system. Under Traoré's leadership, the country was charting a new course of radical independence that was making traditional power structures deeply uncomfortable. Ibrahim Traoré, at just 35, was exactly the kind of leader who made colonial-era establishments nervous. A former military officer who had risen through the ranks not through political connections, but through sheer competence and unwavering principle, he had led 2 successful coups, not for personal gain, but to remove leaders who had failed their people. His speeches about African dignity and self-determination had already begun resonating far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Unlike many African leaders who spoke in carefully diplomatic language, Traoré was refreshingly direct. He wore traditional Faso Dan Fani clothing to state functions, spoke in Moor and Dioula as often as he spoke French, and had an unsettling habit of telling uncomfortable truths with a calm smile. His policies had already begun showing results. Corruption prosecutions had increased by 400%. Foreign mining contracts were being renegotiated to favor Burkina Faso, and youth unemployment was dropping as new infrastructure projects created jobs. But Claire Rousseau and the show's host, Arnaud Bellamy, had different plans for this interview. Arnaud Bellamy was an institution in French media, a silver-haired intellectual who had been the face of Le Grand Débat for over 2 decades. His interviews with world leaders often became defining moments of their careers, usually because he had an exceptional talent for exposing what he saw as the contradictions and hypocrisies of his guests. He was particularly effective with leaders from former French colonies, whom he approached with a paternalistic condescension that his French audience found both entertaining and reassuring. This young captain thinks he can outsmart centuries of French experience, Bellamy told his production team during their pre-show strategy meeting. We'll see how his revolutionary rhetoric holds up under real scrutiny. These military leaders are always so serious, so self-important. A little intellectual pressure will show him for what he really is. The show was filmed in a magnificent studio in the heart of Paris, designed to project French cultural sophistication. Ornate bookshelves lined the walls, classical music played softly in the background, and the lighting was carefully calibrated to make the host look wise and authoritative, while potentially making guests appear harsh or unsophisticated under the bright lights. The audience of about 300 people was carefully curated: French intellectuals, diplomats, journalists, and academics who understood their role in the theater of French soft power. They were there not just to watch, but to participate in the subtle reinforcement of French cultural superiority that had been the show's underlying theme for decades. Captain Traoré arrived at the studio 4 hours before the live broadcast. He wore a deep burgundy Faso d'Anfani Grand Boubou, the traditional flowing robe that immediately marked him as different from the European suits that dominated Parisian political circles. His presence was calm but commanding, not the nervous energy of someone seeking approval, but the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he represented. "Are you prepared for this?" asked his communication advisor, Fatima, as they waited in the green room decorated with French colonial art that neither of them commented on, but both certainly noticed. "Sister," Traoré replied in his characteristic, soft tone, adjusting the traditional cap that completed his outfit. "When you know who you are, preparation is just remembering not to forget." As the studio filled with audience members, the energy was electric with anticipation and barely concealed condescension. Many had come expecting to witness the intellectual dismantling of another upstart African leader. The conversations in the lobby revealed the underlying assumptions. "Let's see if this soldier can handle real questions. Bellamy will expose his lack of sophistication. These military coup leaders are always the same, all rhetoric and no substance." French social media was already buzzing with preview clips and commentary. Le Grand Débat was trending, with many users expressing curiosity tinged with skepticism about this young African leader who dared to challenge French influence. As the cameras began rolling and the show's iconic theme music filled the studio, Bellamy opened with his signature gravitas. "Good evening, and welcome to a very special edition of Le Grand Débat. Tonight, we have the honor of hosting Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, a man who believes Africa is ready to reject centuries of partnership with France. Captain Traoré, welcome to Paris." The captain smiled warmly, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. It is indeed an honor to be here, in this beautiful city that was built in part with the wealth of my ancestors." The response was so matter-of-fact, so free of hostility, that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. A few audience members shifted uncomfortably. Bellamy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but he pressed forward with his prepared opening. The first 30 minutes proceeded as a careful dance of diplomacy and intellectual sparring. Bellamy asked about Burkina Faso's decision to expel French troops, the economic challenges of independence, and the captain's vision for Africa's future. Traoré answered with a combination of statistical precision and philosophical depth that seemed to surprise some audience members. When asked about the French military presence, he responded, "Mr. Bellamy, if your neighbor insisted on keeping armed guards in your house to protect you, how long would you accept this arrangement? We are grateful for France's historical relationship with us, but gratitude should not be confused with permanent dependence." When questioned about economic viability without French support, he calmly cited figures. "Our gold production has increased by 32% since we renegotiated mining contracts to favor Burkina workers. Our cotton exports have found new markets in Asia and other African countries. Independence is not isolation. It is the freedom to choose our partners based on mutual respect rather than historical obligation." His responses were articulate, well-reasoned, and delivered with a quiet confidence that was beginning to make some audience members nod in agreement. But Bellamy was growing frustrated. His questions weren't creating the intellectual trap he had hoped for. The captain wasn't stumbling, wasn't getting defensive, wasn't providing the kind of material that would make for the kind of television his audience expected. Bellamy decided to change tactics. If intellectual arguments weren't working, perhaps it was time to try a more personal approach. He leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of someone about to make an observation that would cut to the heart of the matter. "Captain Traoré," he said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I have to ask, when you speak about representing Africa on the global stage, don't you think how shall I put this, your particular way of expressing yourself, might be a barrier to being taken seriously by the international community?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. The studio audience went completely silent, some looking shocked at the directness of the inquiry, others leaning forward with anticipation. Captain Traoré's communication advisor, watching from the wings, felt her heart rate spike. But Ibrahim Traoré's expression didn't change. He didn't look hurt, angry, or surprised. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely curious about the question. "My particular way of expressing myself?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a tone of genuine inquiry rather than defensiveness. "Well, yes," Bellamy continued, emboldened by what he interpreted as confusion. "Your accent, the way you pronounce certain French words, your, shall we say, non-traditional approach to diplomatic language. Don't you worry that this might make it difficult for serious international leaders to engage with you as an equal?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience, the kind of laughter that people use to fill uncomfortable silence when they're not sure whether what they're witnessing is acceptable or appalling. The cameras captured every reaction, every subtle expression of discomfort or amusement, every moment of this unfolding confrontation. "Captain." Traoré sat in complete silence for what felt like an eternity but was actually about 15 seconds. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not a politician's calculated smile, but something deeper, more genuine, tinged with what might have been pity. "Mr. Bellamy," he began, his voice even softer than before, "may I tell you what you hear when I speak?" The host nodded, perhaps beginning to sense that he had miscalculated, but unable to back down from the path he had chosen. "When I speak French with what you call my accent," Captain Traoré continued, looking directly into the camera, "you are hearing the sound of resistance. You are hearing the voice of a people who were told that their languages were primitive, their cultures backward, their ways of thinking inferior. And yet, here I am, speaking to you in the language you imposed on us, but carrying within that language the rhythm of my mother's lullabies, the cadence of my father's prayers, the melody of my grandmother's stories." The studio had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped moving. You hear incorrect pronunciation, and you assume inferiority. But I hear the beautiful fusion of worlds, the harmony that happens when African wisdom dances with European vocabulary. This accent is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a testament to our ability to make any language our own, without losing our souls in the process. Bellamy opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré raised his hand gently. Not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who wasn't finished speaking. "But let me ask you something, Mr. Bellamy. You speak one language perfectly, and you are proud of how correct it sounds. I speak 4 languages fluently, Moor, Dioula, French, and English, and I understand 3 others. I can address my people in their own tongues, negotiate with Arab leaders in their language, and speak to European diplomats in theirs. Between the two of us, who is actually limited by language?" The question reverberated through the studio like a challenge that no one had expected. Some audience members began to applaud, slowly at first, then with increasing conviction. Bellamy's face had gone from confident to confused, to something approaching genuine embarrassment. But Captain Traoré wasn't finished. He turned directly to face the camera, his expression serious but not angry, passionate but not heated. "To every young African watching this tonight," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction, "I want you to understand something that took me years to learn. They will try to make you ashamed of your voice. They will suggest that sounding like them is the only way to be respected, that adopting their mannerisms is the only path to success, that abandoning your cultural identity is the price of admission to their world." He paused, letting his words settle. "But respect that requires you to diminish yourself is not respect. It is subjugation wearing a smile. Your accent is your ancestry speaking through you. Your different way of pronouncing words is your heritage refusing to be erased. Your imperfect French is actually perfect fusion, the sound of survival, adaptation, and strength." The applause was building now, spreading through the audience like wildfire. Even some of the French intellectuals were clapping, caught up in the power of what they were witnessing. They called our languages dialects to make them seem less important than European languages. They called our music primitive until they borrowed our rhythms for their entertainment. They called our philosophies folklore, until they needed our wisdom to solve problems their systems created. Do not let them call your voice incorrect when it carries the truth they are afraid to hear. Captain Traoré then did something unexpected. He stood up from his chair, not aggressively, but with the dignity of someone who had more to say and needed the full weight of his presence to say it. Mr. Bellamy, you asked if I worry about being taken seriously by international leaders. Let me tell you who takes me seriously. The President of China takes me seriously. Seriously enough to offer partnerships that benefit both our countries. Equally, the leaders of Russia take me seriously. Seriously enough to provide military support without demanding permanent bases on our soil. The presidents of Mali, Niger, and Guinea take me seriously. Seriously enough to coordinate our efforts to remove foreign military presence from our territories. He gestured gently toward Bellamy, his tone remaining calm and respectful, even as his words cut deep. The only people who seem to have trouble taking me seriously are those who still believe that respect flows in only one direction. From Africa to Europe, from former colonies to former colonizers, from the civilized to the backward. But that era is ending, Mr. Bellamy. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with the quiet confidence of people who have remembered who they are. The TDH audience was now openly applauding, some standing, the energy in the room completely transformed. Bellamy looked around helplessly, realizing that his show had been completely transformed, that he had lost control of the narrative he had tried to create. But Captain Traoré wasn't done. He sat back down, his posture relaxed, his expression returning to that characteristic gentle smile. "You know what I find most interesting about this conversation," he said, addressing Bellamy directly. "You invited me here thinking you would expose my limitations. Instead, you have given me a platform to speak truths that needed to be heard by millions of people. You thought you were creating entertainment at my expense. Instead, you have helped me deliver a message of dignity and self-respect that will inspire young Africans for generations." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to that soft tone that somehow commanded more attention than shouting ever could. "So thank you, Mr. Bellamy. Thank you for reminding me why this conversation was necessary. Thank you for demonstrating, perhaps without meaning to, exactly the kind of attitudes that make African independence not just desirable, but essential. And thank you for showing your viewers the difference between confidence and arrogance, between strength and bullying, between questioning and mocking." The camera captured Bellamy's face as the full weight of what had just happened settled over him. He had been outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outdignified by a man he had tried to humiliate. And it had all happened with such grace, such controlled power, that even his embarrassment felt secondary to the profound lesson that had just been delivered to the world. I owe you an apology," Bellamy stammered, his famous composure completely shattered. "That question was inappropriate, disrespectful, and frankly, ignorant." "No apology needed," Captain Traoré replied with genuine warmth. "You gave me exactly what I needed. An opportunity to address misconceptions that have persisted for too long. Sometimes the most important conversations begin with the wrong questions." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but everyone knew that the real conversation had already ended. Bellamy's subsequent questions were respectful, almost reverent. He asked about Burkina Faso's development plans, about regional cooperation, about the captain's vision for Africa's future. And Captain Traoré answered with the same thoughtful precision he had shown throughout, as if the earlier confrontation had been simply one moment in a larger, more important dialogue. But across the world, people were already sharing clips of what they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media exploded in ways that no one had anticipated. Traoré Speaks began trending globally within the first hour. African students studying in European and American universities shared their own stories of being mocked for their accents, their names, their ways of speaking. Second-generation immigrants talked about the shame they had felt about their parents' broken French or English. children of diaspora communities reflected on the pressure. They had felt to sound more French or more American or more British. But something else was happening too. People who had never considered the politics of language and accent were beginning to question their own assumptions. French citizens, who had unconsciously dismissed African leaders as unsophisticated, were forced to confront their own biases. Europeans who had never thought about the psychological impact of linguistic colonialism were suddenly having uncomfortable conversations about their own prejudices. The clip became one of the most watched political videos in Francophone internet history, but its impact went far beyond mere views and shares. In Burkina Faso, Captain Traoré's approval ratings, already high, soared to an unprecedented 94%. But more importantly, applications to Burkinabe universities from the diaspora increased by 500% in the following months. Young Burkinabe who had been considering emigration began to see their homeland with new eyes. The economy continued to grow, but now there was something else growing alongside it, a sense of collective dignity that had been dormant for generations. The response rippled across Africa. President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo gave a speech at the African Union in which he spoke deliberately in Lingala for the first 10 minutes before switching to French, explaining that diplomacy should never require cultural amnesia. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana wore full kente cloth to his next meeting with European leaders, stating that African dignity is not a costume, it is our birthright. In Mali and Niger, where similar anti-French sentiment had been building, Captain Traoré's response became a rallying cry. Young people organized accent pride demonstrations, speaking publicly in their local languages mixed with French, celebrating the linguistic fusion that Traoré had so eloquently defended. The response wasn't universally positive, of course. Some French commentators accused Captain Traoré of being divisive and unnecessarily confrontational. Some suggested that his response was calculated political theater designed to appeal to anti-French sentiment. Others argued that he had overreacted to what they claimed was a legitimate question about communication effectiveness. But even these critics had to acknowledge that he had handled the situation with remarkable intelligence and grace. More importantly, the conversation had shifted. What had begun as criticism of Captain Traoré had become a broader discussion about linguistic prejudice, cultural respect, and the ongoing impacts of colonialism. Arnaud Bellamy himself became a figure of controversy. Some viewers called for his firing, branding him as representing the worst of French paternalism and cultural arrogance. Protests were organized outside the television station. Online petitions demanding his removal garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. But Bellamy, to his credit, seemed genuinely affected by what had happened. In a remarkable follow-up broadcast 3 weeks later, he opened his show with an extended apology and reflection. 3 weeks ago, I asked a question that I thought was about communication effectiveness. I realize now that I was perpetuating a form of linguistic imperialism that I had never even considered. Captain Traoré taught me something that night, about dignity, about identity, and about the power dynamics embedded in every conversation, between former colonizers and former colonies. I thought I was being intellectually rigorous. I was actually being culturally arrogant. He paused, looking directly into the camera with an expression of genuine remorse. I have spent my career believing that my role was to ask tough questions and expose contradictions. But I failed to examine my own contradictions, my own assumptions, my own prejudices. Captain Traoré showed me that true intellectual rigor requires not just questioning others, but questioning the frameworks within which we ask our questions. The show's format began to change subtly in the weeks that followed. Bellamy started approaching international guests, particularly those from former French colonies, with more genuine curiosity and less condescension. He began learning basic phrases in other languages to greet guests in their mother tongues. The change was gradual but unmistakable. He had been transformed by his encounter with dignity. Captain Traoré, meanwhile, continued to lead Burkina, Faso, with the same steady hand that had served him so well in that Paris studio. His policies continued to show remarkable results. Foreign mining contracts were renegotiated to ensure that 60% of profits stayed in Burkina Faso. New schools were built in rural areas with instruction in local languages, as well as French. Youth employment programs were expanded, focusing on technology and sustainable agriculture. But now there was global attention on his leadership style. He was invited to speak at universities around the world, not just about politics or economics, but about leadership, dignity, and authentic communication. Harvard Business School created a case study based on his television appearance. Oxford included his speech in their curriculum on post-colonial leadership. The Sorbonne, perhaps most significantly, invited him to deliver a lecture on language, power, and cultural identity. In every speech, he carried the same message he had delivered that night in Paris, that true strength comes not from conformity to external expectations, but from the courage to be authentically yourself while engaging respectfully with others. But perhaps the most powerful impact of that night was seen in the generation of young people who witnessed it. Aminata, a 17-year-old Burkinabe student studying in Lyon, wrote in her school newspaper, "Before that night, I tried to hide where I came from. I would avoid speaking more with my friends. I would correct my accent to sound more French. I would downplay my father's traditional healing knowledge because I thought it made us seem backward. But when I saw Captain Traoré turn his difference into his strength, I realized I had been trying to erase the most beautiful parts of myself. Now I speak with pride about our traditions, our languages, our ways of seeing the world. And my French classmates don't hear primitive Africa. They hear the wisdom of a civilization that has survived and thrived for millennia." Similar stories poured in from around the world. Young people who had been taught to be ashamed of their heritage began to see it as a source of strength. Parents who had been pressuring their children to assimilate began to encourage them to embrace their cultural identity while still succeeding in their adopted countries. Educators started incorporating discussions about linguistic diversity and cultural pride into their curricula. The interview became required viewing in African studies programs, analyzed as a masterclass in cultural diplomacy and authentic leadership. It was discussed in psychology courses as a demonstration of how dignity can disarm aggression and transform conflict into connection. Political science professors used it to illustrate the power of soft power and the importance of authentic communication in international relations. But beyond all the academic analysis and political commentary, there was something simpler and more profound at work. In a world that often rewards loudness and aggression, Captain Traoré had shown that quiet strength could be more powerful than any weapon. In a media landscape that thrived on conflict and controversy, he had demonstrated that grace could be more captivating than drama. In a global conversation often dominated by division and hostility, he had proven that dignity could build bridges where anger could only burn them. 1 year later, Burkina Faso hosted the first ever Sahel Youth Leadership Summit, attracting over 15,000 young people from across West Africa and the diaspora. The theme was Authentic Voices, Global Impact, and the opening ceremony featured a video montage of young Africans speaking proudly in their accents, their languages, their own authentic voices, interspersed with clips from Captain Traoré's legendary television appearance. In his keynote address, delivered in more French and English, Captain Traoré reflected on that night in Paris. "They invited me to defend Africa. Instead, I realized that Africa doesn't need defending. It needs celebrating. They expected me to be ashamed of who we are. Instead, I discovered that our identity is our strength, our diversity is our wealth, and our voices, all of our voices, with all of their beautiful variations, are our victory." The audience erupted in applause that lasted for 8 minutes. But more importantly, they left that summit with a new understanding of what leadership could look like. Not the domination of others, but the elevation of everyone. Not the erasure of difference, but the celebration of diversity. Not the adoption of foreign standards, but the confident assertion of authentic identity in dialogue with the world. That night in Paris, Arnaud Bellamy thought he was asking a simple question about communication effectiveness. What he actually did was provide a platform for one of the most powerful lessons in dignity, identity, and authentic leadership that the world had seen in decades. He thought he was creating entertainment for his French audience. Instead, he catalyzed a movement that stretched from the universities of Paris to the villages of Burkina Faso, from the diaspora communities of North America to the youth organizations of West Africa. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré? He simply did what he had always done. He spoke his truth with quiet strength, remained authentic to his values while engaging respectfully with others, and let that truth transform everything around it. Because sometimes the most powerful response to mockery isn't anger or retaliation. It's the kind of dignity that turns ridicule into respect, transforms a moment of intended humiliation into a movement of hope, and proves that when authenticity meets prejudice, authenticity always wins. The clip still circulates today, still inspiring new generations of young people to embrace their authentic voices while engaging confidently with the world. And every time someone watches it, they witness the same profound truth, that when dignity speaks quietly, even arrogance has no choice but to listen, learn, and ultimately respect.